Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift into peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey to the western coast of South America, to the lands that would become Peru, where some of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world flourished for thousands of years. As you settle in, let your mind wander through time, back beyond the Inca Empire that many know, to the mysterious cultures that came before. The Norte Chico, the Chavín, the Moche, the Nazca, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, and many others. Each civilization left its mark on the landscape, building monuments, creating art, and developing sophisticated societies in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. Take a deep breath, relax, and let us begin our journey through the mists of time. If you enjoy tonight's story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Land and its Earliest Peoples. To understand the civilizations of ancient Peru, we must first understand the land itself. Peru is a country of dramatic contrasts. Along its western edge runs one of the driest deserts on Earth, the Atacama Desert, where some weather stations have never recorded rainfall. Yet parallel to this coastal desert, running north to south, rise the towering peaks of the Andes Mountains, some reaching heights of over 20,000 feet. And beyond the mountains to the east lies the beginning of the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. This geographical diversity created distinct ecological zones, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities for human settlement. The ancient peoples of Peru adapted to these varied environments in remarkable ways, developing agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and cultural practices suited to their particular regions. The earliest evidence of human presence in Peru dates back approximately 15,000 years during the late Pleistocene epoch. These Paleo-Indian peoples were hunter-gatherers who followed the great herds of now extinct megafauna across the landscape. They crafted stone tools, hunted large game, and gradually began to exploit the rich marine resources along the Pacific coast. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and the climate warmed, these early inhabitants began to shift their lifestyles. The megafauna died out, whether from climate change, overhunting, or a combination of factors. Human populations adapted by diversifying their food sources, relying more heavily on smaller game, fish, shellfish, and wild plant foods. Between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, a crucial transition occurred. People in different regions of Peru began experimenting with agriculture. In the highlands, communities started cultivating potatoes, quinoa, and other Andean crops. Along the coast, early farmers grew squash, beans, and cotton. This shift to agriculture happened independently in Peru, making it one of the handful of places in the world where farming was invented rather than imported. Interestingly, the development of agriculture in Peru followed a different pattern than in many other parts of the world. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, agriculture and animal husbandry developed together, with domesticated grains and livestock forming the foundation of settled life. In Peru, however, maritime resources played an equally important role. Coastal communities relied heavily on fishing and shellfish gathering even as they began farming. creating what some scholars call a maritime foundation for civilization. The domestication of plants in the Andes was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years. Early farmers selected seeds from wild plants that had desirable characteristics, larger tubers, better tasting fruits, easier to harvest grains. Generation by generation, these wild species transformed into the domesticated crops that would sustain Andean civilizations. The potato, which originated in the region around Lake Titicaca, eventually developed into thousands of distinct varieties, each adapted to different altitudes and microclimates. Quinoa, a grain-like seed that thrives at high altitudes where other crops fail, became a staple food. Maize, originally domesticated in Mexico, reached Peru around 6,000 years ago and was adapted to local conditions. Animal domestication in Peru was more limited than in the Old World. The Andean peoples domesticated the llama and alpaca, both members of the camelid family, which provided wool, meat, and served as pack animals. They also kept guinea pigs as a food source and domesticated the Muscovy duck. Unlike in Eurasia, Africa, and North America, there were no wild horses, cattle, or pigs to domesticate in South America. This limited the types of animal products available and meant that llamas, which can carry about 70 to 90 pounds, were the only beasts of burden. The development of pottery marks another significant milestone in Peruvian prehistory. The earliest known ceramics in the Americas come from the Amazon basin and date to around 5,000 years ago. Pottery making reached the Peruvian coast by 4,000 years ago and spread to the highlands shortly thereafter. Early vessels were simple, utilitarian forms used for cooking and storage. But over time, pottery became an important medium for artistic expression, with different cultures developing distinctive styles that help archaeologists identify and date sites. Textile production emerged as another crucial technology. The dry climate of coastal Peru has preserved textiles that would have decayed in wetter environments, giving us a unique window into ancient weaving techniques. Some of the oldest textiles in the Americas have been found in Peru, dating back nearly 4,000 years. These early fabrics show sophisticated weaving techniques, including complex patterns and multiple colours. Cotton, which grew well in coastal valleys, became the primary fibre for textiles, though highland communities also used wool from llamas and alpacas. By around 5,000 years ago, the preconditions for civilization were in place. People lived in permanent settlements, grew crops, made pottery and textiles, and had developed increasingly complex social structures. What happened next would surprise archaeologists when they first uncovered the evidence. In the arid river valleys of north-central Peru, a civilization emerged that would challenge long-held assumptions about how complex societies develop. Part 2. Norte Chico, the first civilization. In the 1990s, archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis was conducting surveys in the Soup Valley, about 120 miles north of modern Lima. The valley seemed unpromising at first glance, a dry landscape dotted with what appeared to be natural hills. But Shady suspected these hills were not natural at all. She began excavations at the largest site, a place called Caral, and what she discovered would rewrite the history of ancient Peru. Caral was not a natural formation, but a vast complex of pyramids, plazas, and residential areas. Radiocarbon dating of plant fibers used in the construction placed the site's major building phase between 5,000 and 4,600 years ago, making it contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt and predating the major centers of Mesopotamia. More remarkably, Caral was not alone. As Shady and other researchers continued their work, they identified at least 25 large ceremonial centers in the Norte Chico region, all dating to roughly the same period. This discovery was revolutionary because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the rise of civilization. Conventional wisdom held that civilizations developed in fertile river valleys where intensive agriculture could support large populations. Think of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. The Norte Chico region, however, is one of the driest places on Earth. The river valleys that cut through the coastal desert are green only because of runoff from the Andes, and even with irrigation, agricultural productivity is limited. So how did civilization develop here? The answer lies in the ocean. The Pacific waters of Peru are among the richest fishing grounds in the world, thanks to the Humboldt Current, which brings cold, nutrient-rich water up from the depths. This upwelling supports vast populations of anchovies and other small fish, which in turn attract larger fish, marine mammals, and seabirds. The Norte Chico people exploited these marine resources intensively. At Caral and other sites, archaeologists have found enormous quantities of fish bones, especially anchovies, as well as remains of shellfish, sea mammals, and seabirds. The Norte Chico civilization thus represents what some scholars call a maritime foundation for complex society. Rather than relying primarily on agriculture, these people built their civilization on the bounty of the sea, supplemented by farming in the river valleys. They grew cotton, which they wove into fishing nets, and cultivated squash, beans, and other crops, but seafood provided the bulk of their protein. The architectural achievements of the Norte Chico people were substantial. At Caral, the largest pyramid, called the Pyramide Maya, measures about 500 feet by 450 feet at its base and rises to a height of about 90 feet. This is not as large as the Great Pyramids of Egypt, but it represents a massive investment of labor and planning. The pyramid was built in stages, with workers hauling millions of shikra bags, woven mesh bags filled with rocks, which were used to create the core of the structure. The platforms and walls were then covered with plaster. Caral's layout suggests careful urban planning. The site covers about 165 acres and includes 6 large platform mounds, several sunken circular plazas, residential areas, and various other structures. The sunken circular plazas are particularly interesting features, ranging from about 30 to 80 feet in diameter. These plazas were likely gathering places for ceremonies and community events. Other Norte Chico sites show similar features. Aspero, located directly on the coast, has 6 platform mounds and extensive residential areas. Aspero's position on the ocean suggests it may have been a centre for fishing and maritime trade. Further inland, sites like Banduria and Huaracanga also feature platform mounds and plazas, indicating that this architectural tradition was widespread. What kind of society built these monuments? The Norte Chico centres lack clear evidence of warfare. Archaeologists have found no fortifications, no caches of weapons, and little evidence of violent trauma on human remains. This doesn't mean conflict was absent, but it suggests warfare was not a dominant force in Norte Chico society. The monumental architecture itself suggests hierarchical organization. Building these pyramids and plazas required organizing large labor forces, planning construction projects, and mobilizing resources. This implies the existence of leaders with the authority to coordinate such efforts. The absence of pottery at Norte Chico sites is puzzling. Pottery making was known in South America by this time, yet the Norte Chico people apparently chose not to adopt it or had not yet encountered the technology. Instead, they made extensive use of gourds as containers and may have stored and transported goods in woven bags and baskets, which would not survive in the archaeological record as readily as ceramics. One intriguing find at several Norte Chico sites is knotted string devices called quipus. Quipus would later be used by the Inca as a system for recording numerical information and possibly other data. The Norte Chico quipus are much simpler than the elaborate Inca examples, but their presence suggests that these ancient people were developing ways to record and transmit information, perhaps for tracking trade goods or other resources. Trade networks connected the Norte Chico sites to each other and to more distant regions. At Caral, archaeologists have found shells from the coast, obsidian from the highlands, and other materials that came from far away. This suggests the existence of exchange networks that moved goods across different ecological zones, allowing coastal people access to highland products and vice versa. Around 4,000 years ago, the Norte Chico civilization began to decline. The reasons are not entirely clear, but climate change may have played a role. Evidence suggests that the region experienced a period of drought around this time, which could have reduced river flows and made irrigation more difficult. The ocean may have also experienced changes that affected fish populations. As conditions became less favourable, people may have abandoned the large centres and dispersed to smaller communities. The Norte Chico civilization left no written records, and much about their society remains mysterious. We don't know what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or what beliefs motivated their monumental construction projects, but their achievement was remarkable. For a period of about 400 to 600 years, these people created the first urban centers in the Americas, demonstrating that civilization could develop through multiple pathways, not just the agricultural route seen in the Old World. Part 3. The Early Horizon and Chavín Culture. After the decline of the Norte Chico centers, Peru entered a period of regional development during which different areas followed their own cultural trajectories. Then, around 3,000 years ago, a new cultural phenomenon emerged that would influence a vast area of Peru. Archaeologists call this the Chavín culture, named after the site of Chavín de Huántar, located in the northern highlands. Chavín de Huántar sits at an altitude of about 10,000 feet at the confluence of two rivers in a mountain valley. The site's location was strategically chosen. It lies on an important trade route connecting the coast to the Amazon basin, and the valley offered good agricultural land and access to water. Between 3,000 and 2,300 years ago, Chavín de Huántar grew into a major ceremonial centre, attracting pilgrims from across Peru. The architecture of Chavín de Huántar is impressive and mysterious. The site's core consists of massive stone temples built in a distinctive style. The old temple, the earliest major structure, features a U-shaped floor plan with a circular sunken plaza in the center. Inside the temple, a labyrinth of narrow galleries and passages winds through the interior. At the heart of this maze stands the lanzon, a carved granite monolith about 15 feet tall, which likely served as the temple's principal cult image. The lanzon depicts a supernatural being with a human-like body, clawed hands and feet, and a face featuring fangs and snakes emerging from the head. This being probably represented an important deity in Chavín religion. The galleries around the lanzon may have been used for rituals, with priests or initiates moving through the dark passages in ceremonial processions. The temple's builders even incorporated hydraulic engineering, creating underground channels that carried water through the complex, producing roaring sounds that would have added to the mystical atmosphere during ceremonies. Later builders expanded Chavín de Huántar, adding new structures including the new temple, which is even larger than the old temple. They also created plazas, stairways, and multiple levels, transforming the site into an elaborate ceremonial complex. The stone masonry shows high craftsmanship with carefully cut and fitted blocks. One of the most remarkable features of Chavín de Huántar is the sculptural decoration. Many buildings incorporated carved stone heads, called tenon heads, which projected from the exterior walls. These heads depicted supernatural beings and transformed humans, with fanged mouths, staring eyes, and elaborate headdresses. Some show human features mixed with those of jaguars, eagles, serpents, or caimans. The most famous carved stone at the site, besides the lanzon, is the Tello obelisk, a large stone shaft covered with intricate low-relief carvings showing supernatural beings, plants, and animals. The art style of Chavín de Huántar spread far beyond the site itself. Similar imagery appears in pottery, textiles, shellwork, and stone carving from sites across Peru, from the northern coast to the southern highlands. This widespread distribution of Chavín-style art suggests the site's influence reached hundreds of miles in all directions. But what created this influence? Scholars have debated this question for decades. Some believe Chavín de Huántar was the center of an empire that conquered neighboring regions and imposed its culture on subject peoples. However, there's little evidence of military conquest. The site lacks fortifications, and there's no clear evidence of administrative control over distant regions. A more widely accepted interpretation is that Chavín de Huántar was a major pilgrimage center and oracle shrine. People from various regions traveled to the site to consult with priests, make offerings, and participate in ceremonies. The prestige of the shrine led local leaders to adopt Chavín religious imagery and practices, spreading the culture through voluntary adoption rather than conquest. What was the Chavín religion about? The art provides clues, but no definitive answers. The prominence of jaguar, eagle, and serpent imagery suggests these animals held special significance. The jaguar, the largest predator in South America, may have symbolized power and ferocity. The harpy eagle, a massive raptor, could represent the upper world or the sky. Serpents might have been associated with the underworld or water. Many carved figures show humans transforming into these creatures, perhaps representing shamanic transformation. Some scholars believe the Chavín religion involved the use of hallucinogenic substances. The San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, grows in the region and has been used in Andean spiritual practices into modern times. Chavín art sometimes depicts individuals holding or consuming plants that may represent San Pedro or other psychoactive substances. The elaborate underground galleries at Chavín de Huántar would have been ideal settings for vision quests or other consciousness-altering rituals. Chavín material culture shows considerable sophistication. Potters created fine ceramics in distinctive forms, including stirrup spout bottles, a vessel shape that would remain popular in Peruvian cultures for centuries. These bottles have a U-shaped spout rising from the top of a closed vessel, allowing liquid to be poured and stored without evaporation. Chavín potters decorated their vessels with incised designs showing the same supernatural beings found in stone sculpture. Textile production also flourished during the Chavín period. While few Chavín textiles have survived, those that have show complex weaving techniques and sophisticated designs. Weavers created multicolored fabrics with intricate patterns, sometimes incorporating the same religious imagery seen in other media. Metallurgy emerged as an important technology during the Chavín period. Metal workers learned to work gold, silver, and copper, creating ornaments, tools, and ceremonial objects. They developed techniques like hammering, annealing, soldering, and alloying. Some Chavín gold objects show remarkable craftsmanship, with thin sheets of metal shaped into three-dimensional forms and decorated with elaborate designs. The Chavín period, also called the Early Horizon, lasted roughly from 3,000 to 2,200 years ago. Around 2,200 years ago, Chavín de Huántar's influence began to wane. The reasons for this decline are unclear. Environmental changes, shifts in trade routes, or the emergence of rival religious centers may have contributed. As Chavín's influence faded, Peru again entered a period of regional development, with different areas developing their own distinctive cultures. Part 4. The Early Intermediate Period. Regional Diversity. Following the decline of Chavín influence, Peru entered what archaeologists call the Early Intermediate Period, lasting roughly from 2,200 to 1,400 years ago. During this era, different regions developed their own sophisticated cultures, each with distinctive art styles, architectural traditions, and social organizations. The most prominent of these cultures were the Moche on the north coast, the Nazca on the south coast, and the Recuay in the northern highlands. Let us begin with the Moche, one of the most extensively studied ancient Peruvian cultures. The Moche civilization flourished in the valleys of the north coast from about 2,000 to 1,300 years ago. Unlike Chavín, which was primarily a religious cult, the Moche appear to have been a more politically unified society, or perhaps a series of closely related polities sharing a common culture. The Moche inhabited a challenging environment. The north coast of Peru receives almost no rainfall, making agriculture entirely dependent on irrigation from rivers flowing down from the Andes. The Moche responded to this challenge by building extensive irrigation systems, including canals that brought water many miles from the rivers to previously arid land. Some of these canals were engineering marvels, running for dozens of miles and requiring careful planning to maintain the proper gradient. By expanding the irrigated area, the Moche increased agricultural production and supported larger populations. The Moche built impressive ceremonial centers and cities. The largest, located in the Moche Valley, featured two massive adobe brick pyramids called the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna. The Huaca del Sol, the larger of the two, was constructed from an estimated 140 million adobe bricks. Before erosion and looting damaged it, the structure may have measured about 110 feet tall and covered roughly 12 acres. This pyramid probably served as an administrative and possibly residential complex for the elite. The Huaca de la Luna, though smaller, has revealed some of the most spectacular Moche art. The pyramid's walls were decorated with elaborate polychrome murals showing supernatural beings, warriors, and ceremonial scenes. The most famous is a repeated image of a fanged deity with serpents and other attributes, often called the fanged deity or decapitator god. These murals were repainted many times, with each new layer covering the previous one, suggesting the temple was renovated periodically in a cycle of renewal. Moche art provides a remarkably detailed picture of their culture. The Moche were among the most skilled potters in the ancient Americas. They created thousands of ceramic vessels depicting every aspect of their lives. Some pottery shows naturalistic scenes of daily activities, hunting, fishing, farming, weaving, and food preparation. Other vessels depict warfare, sacrifice, and elaborate ceremonies. Still others show erotic scenes with explicit detail, the purpose of which scholars still debate. Were these vessels used in fertility rituals? Did they serve educational purposes? Were they simply artistic expressions? We may never know for certain. One particularly important category of Moche pottery is the portrait vessel. These are ceramic bottles made to look like human heads, rendered with such realism that they appear to be portraits of actual individuals. The faces show different ages, expressions, and even evidence of diseases or injuries. Some portrait vessels seem to show the same individual at different ages, suggesting they may have commemorated specific rulers or important people. The Moche also created elaborate metalwork. They were skilled goldsmiths and silversmiths, producing jewelry, ceremonial objects, and decorative items of high quality. The most famous example of Moche metalwork comes from the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, discovered in 1987 by archaeologist Walter Alva. The Lord of Sipan was buried around 1,700 years ago with a wealth of precious objects. His tomb contained multiple layers of coffins and was surrounded by the burials of retainers who were apparently sacrificed to accompany him in death. The grave goods included gold and silver jewelry, ceremonial weapons, elaborate headdresses, and hundreds of pottery vessels. The Lord himself wore a gold and silver costume covered with intricate decorative elements. One particularly striking object was a golden rattle in the shape of a pyramid, decorated with tiny gold spheres that produced sound when shaken. The Sipan discovery revealed much about Moche society and religion. The iconography on the tomb goods matches scenes depicted in Moche art, showing an elaborate ceremony that scholars call the sacrifice ceremony. In this ritual, prisoners of war were sacrificed, and their blood was presented to elaborately dressed elite figures. The Lord of Sipan's regalia matches that of one of these elite participants, suggesting he played this role in actual ceremonies. The Moche appear to have engaged in warfare regularly, though whether this was primarily for territorial expansion, resource acquisition, or ritual purposes remains debated. Moche art frequently depicts warriors in elaborate costumes, often shown capturing prisoners. The prisoners are typically shown naked and bound, being led before important figures. Archaeological evidence, including fortress-like structures and skeletal remains showing signs of violent death, confirms that warfare was indeed part of Moche life. Moche religion featured a complex pantheon of supernatural beings. Besides the Fang deity, art depicts numerous other supernatural figures, including a wrinkled deity associated with the ocean and marine resources, a moon animal that may represent a lunar deity, and various human-animal hybrids. The meaning of these figures and how they related to Moche beliefs about the cosmos remains a subject of ongoing research. Around 1,300 years ago, the Moche culture began to decline. Evidence suggests environmental stress may have contributed. The region experienced severe droughts and also catastrophic El Niño events that brought destructive floods and disrupted the climate. Archaeological sites show evidence of flooding, destruction of irrigation systems, and abandonment of settlements. Political instability may have followed environmental crisis, leading to the collapse of Moche political authority. Eventually, the Moche cultural tradition faded, though some elements persisted and influenced later cultures. Part 5. The Nazca and the Lines. While the Moche dominated the north coast, a different culture flourished on the south coast. The Nazca culture emerged around 2,100 years ago and lasted until about 1,300 years ago. The Nazca inhabited the river valleys of the south coast, another extremely arid region where agriculture depended entirely on water from Andean rivers. The Nazca are most famous for the Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor of the Pampa de San Jose and surrounding areas. These figures include straight lines, geometric shapes, and stylized depictions of animals, plants, and supernatural beings. Some of the lines run perfectly straight for miles across the desert. The animal figures include a hummingbird, a monkey, a spider, a condor, a killer whale, and many others, ranging from about 100 to over 1,000 feet in length. The lines were created by removing the dark oxidized pebbles that cover the desert surface, exposing the lighter colored soil beneath. The extreme aridity and lack of wind in the region have preserved the lines for centuries. Many of the figures are so large that they can only be fully appreciated from the air, which has led to much speculation about their purpose. Theories about the Nazca lines have ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Some early researchers suggested they were ancient astronomical calendars or markers for celestial events. Others proposed they were pathways for religious processions or offerings to mountain and water deities. More outlandish theories involved ancient astronauts or alien visitors, though these have no basis in archaeological evidence. Modern research suggests the lines served multiple purposes. Some lines do align with astronomical events, such as solstices and the rising and setting of certain stars. This suggests they may have been part of a ritual calendar, marking important dates for agricultural or ceremonial activities. The animal figures may have represented constellations or religious symbols. Many researchers believe the lines were sacred pathways, walked during pilgrimages or ceremonies, possibly related to water and fertility rituals, crucial concerns in such an arid environment. Beyond the lines, the Nazca created a rich material culture. Nazca pottery is among the most beautiful produced in ancient Peru. Nazca potters specialized in polychrome ceramics, vessels decorated with multiple vibrant colors: red, orange, yellow, white, black, and various shades of brown. These colors were applied before firing in mineral-based slips that created a lustrous finish. The imagery on Nazca pottery reflects their religious beliefs and mythology. Common motifs include the staff deity, a frontal figure holding staffs or plants, killer whales, trophy heads, agricultural products, and various supernatural beings. Some vessels show scenes of combat or ritual, while others depict the natural world with realistic renderings of plants and animals. Trophy heads appear frequently in Nazca art and archaeology. These were human heads that had been removed from bodies, with the skull modified for display or carrying. The forehead was pierced and a cord threaded through, allowing the head to be carried or worn. Dozens of trophy heads have been found at Nazca sites. Analysis shows they came from people of various ages and both sexes, suggesting they were taken from enemies in warfare or raids. The prominence of trophy heads in Nazca art and the physical evidence of the practice indicate it was an important part of Nazca ritual and perhaps warfare. Nazca textiles show the same artistic sophistication as their pottery. Weavers created complex fabrics with intricate patterns and multiple colors. Some textiles feature elaborate embroidery showing supernatural beings and ceremonial scenes. The dry climate of the south coast has preserved many textiles that would have decayed elsewhere, giving us an unusually complete picture of Nazca weaving technology and artistic traditions. The Nazca built ceremonial centers, though these were generally smaller and less monumental than the Great Pyramids of the north coast. The most important Nazca center was Cahuachi, located in the Nazca Valley. Cahuachi consisted of roughly 40 mounds, many of which were natural hills modified with adobe construction. The site covered several square miles and included plazas, ceremonial platforms, and residential areas. Cahuachi appears to have functioned as a pilgrimage center. The site shows evidence of periodic occupation rather than permanent residence, suggesting people gathered there for ceremonies and festivals before returning to their home communities. Excavations have uncovered offerings of pottery, textiles, and food, as well as evidence of ceremonial feasting. Around 1,400 years ago, Cahuachi was deliberately abandoned, with buildings ritually sealed and buried. Like the Moche, the Nazca faced environmental challenges that may have contributed to their decline. Evidence suggests the region experienced significant droughts. The Nazca responded by building underground aqueducts called puquios, some of which still function today. These stone-lined channels tapped into underground water sources, bringing water to agricultural fields. Despite these efforts, environmental stress combined with possible political instability led to the decline of Nazca culture around 1,300 years ago. Part 6. The Middle Horizon, Wari and Tiwanaku. Around 1,400 years ago, Peru entered what archaeologists call the Middle Horizon, a period dominated by two powerful states, the Wari Empire in the central and northern highlands and the Tiwanaku state, centered around Lake Titicaca in the southern highlands. These two cultures represent a new level of political complexity in the Andes, with evidence of administrative hierarchies, long-distance trade networks, and what may have been imperial expansion. The Tiwanaku culture developed in the high plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca at an altitude of over 12,000 feet. This is one of the most challenging environments for agriculture anywhere in the world. Temperatures regularly drop below freezing at night, even during the growing season, and the thin air means crops receive more ultraviolet radiation and less oxygen than at lower elevations. Despite these challenges, the Tiwanaku people developed sophisticated agricultural techniques that allowed them to thrive. The most impressive Tiwanaku innovation was raised field agriculture. Workers dug a network of canals and used the excavated earth to build raised planting platforms. During the day, water in the canals absorbed heat from the sun. At night, when temperatures dropped, this water released heat, creating a microclimate that protected crops from frost. The system also managed water levels, preventing both flooding and drought. With this technology, Tiwanaku farmers could grow potatoes, quinoa, and other crops reliably in an environment where agriculture would otherwise be extremely risky. The city of Tiwanaku became a major urban center. At its peak, around 1,000 to 1,200 years ago, the city may have housed between 30,000 and 70,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient Andes. The site features massive stone architecture, including temples, palaces, and large ceremonial platforms. The most famous structure at Tiwanaku is the Acapana Pyramid, a stepped platform about 55 feet high and covering over 50,000 square feet. The pyramid was built from precisely cut and fitted stone blocks, some weighing many tons. Water channels ran through the structure, both for practical purposes and possibly for ritual reasons, as water held great significance in Andean religion. Another remarkable structure is the Kalasasaya, a rectangular platform with stone pillars forming a wall around its perimeter. Within this enclosure stands the famous Gateway of the Sun, a single block of andesite stone weighing about 10 tons, carved with elaborate reliefs. The central figure on the gateway is a front-facing deity holding staffs, similar to the staff deity seen in earlier cultures like Chavín. Surrounding this central figure are rows of winged attendants, possibly representing birds or supernatural helpers. The gateway may have had astronomical significance, with its position marking important solar events. Tiwanaku stonework shows remarkable precision. Blocks were cut to fit together so tightly that mortar was unnecessary. Some blocks have complex shapes, with multiple angles and indentations that lock them together. How workers cut and fitted these stones without metal tools remains impressive. They probably used stone hammers and abrasives along with careful measurement and planning. Tiwanaku influence spread far beyond the Lake Titicaca region. Tiwanaku-style pottery, textiles, and artifacts have been found along the Peruvian and Chilean coasts, in valleys of the eastern Andes, and throughout the southern highland region. Whether this represents direct political control, trade relationships, or the spread of religious ideas remains debated. Some scholars see Tiwanaku as an empire that conquered and administered distant territories. Others interpret the evidence as indicating a more decentralized network of communities linked by shared religious beliefs and trade relationships centered on the prestige and sacred authority of Tiwanaku. While Tiwanaku dominated the southern highlands, the Wari Empire emerged in the central highlands, centered on the city of Wari near modern Ayacucho. The Wari culture drew on earlier traditions, particularly the Nazca culture of the south coast and the Huapa culture of the Ayacucho region, but developed its own distinctive style and political organization. The city of Wari became a major urban center. At its peak, roughly 1,100 to 1,200 years ago, the city may have had a population of 40,000 to 70,000 people. The site covers several square miles and includes residential compounds, administrative buildings, temples, and workshops. The architecture shows planned construction, with large rectangular enclosures subdivided into rooms, corridors, and courtyards. Walls were built from roughly cut stones set in mud mortar and often covered with plaster. Unlike Tiwanaku, which is famous for its monumental stone architecture, Wari sites are characterized more by their extensive administrative complexes and evidence of state organization. Wari sites show standardized architecture, suggesting central planning and control. Large rectangular compounds often followed similar layouts, with specific areas designated for administration, storage, craft production, and residence. One of the most distinctive features of Wari culture is its extensive road system. The Wari built roads connecting their capital to distant provinces, facilitating communication, troop movement, and the transport of goods. These roads often included way stations and administrative centers where officials could manage local populations and collect tribute. This infrastructure would later be adopted and expanded by the Inca Empire. Wari pottery shows a distinctive style that combines elements from earlier cultures. Wari potters made large urns and jars, often decorated with geometric patterns and stylized figures. A common motif is the front-facing deity figure, similar to images seen at Tiwanaku and earlier at Chavín, suggesting continuity in religious traditions. Wari ceramics also often feature smaller subsidiary figures and geometric designs. The relationship between Wari and Tiwanaku has long interested scholars. These two powerful states were contemporaneous, and their spheres of influence overlapped in some areas, yet there's little evidence of direct conflict between them. They shared some artistic and religious motifs, particularly the staff deity image, but maintained distinct material cultures. Some scholars suggest they may have had different but complementary roles, with Tiwanaku functioning more as a religious center and Wari as a political and military power. Both Wari and Tiwanaku collapsed around 1,000 years ago. The reasons for their decline are not entirely clear, but climate change appears to have been a factor. Evidence indicates a prolonged drought affected the Andes around this time. For Tiwanaku, which depended heavily on the raised field system around Lake Titicaca, drought would have been devastating. Falling water levels in the lake would have disrupted agriculture and undermined the economic base of the state. For Wari, drought would have affected agricultural production throughout their territory. Political fragmentation may have followed environmental stress, with provinces breaking away as the central government lost the ability to provide benefits or enforce control. Archaeological evidence shows that both Wari and Tiwanaku sites were abandoned or greatly reduced in population during this period. Part 7. The Late Intermediate Period, the Chimú Kingdom. After the collapse of Wari and Tiwanaku, Peru again entered a period of regional development, the Late Intermediate period, lasting from about 1,000 to 540 years ago. Various kingdoms and chiefdoms emerged in different regions, but the largest and most powerful was the Chimú kingdom on the north coast. The Chimú were the successors to the Moche, inheriting and building upon Moche traditions. The Chimú capital, Chan, became the largest city built in pre-Columbian South America. Located in the Moche Valley near the Pacific coast, Chan at its peak housed perhaps 60,000 people and covered nearly 8 square miles. Chan's architecture reflects sophisticated urban planning. The city centre consists of 10 large rectangular compounds called ciudadelas, each covering many acres and surrounded by high walls. These ciudadelas appear to have functioned as royal palaces and administrative centres. Each compound includes residential areas, storage rooms, courtyards, and burial platforms. The walls were decorated with intricate friezes showing geometric patterns, fish, seabirds, and other marine creatures, reflecting the importance of the ocean to Chimú culture. One theory about the ciudadelas suggests each was built by a successive ruler and served as his residence during life and his tomb after death. When a ruler died, his ciudadela was sealed, and a new ruler built a new compound. This practice, if accurate, would parallel the later Inca custom, where dead rulers retained ownership of their property, requiring each new ruler to acquire his own estate. Beyond the ciudadelas, Chan included residential neighbourhoods for commoners, craft workshops, and cemetery areas. The city showed clear social stratification, with the elite living in spacious compounds with decorated walls, while commoners occupied smaller, simpler dwellings. Craft specialists, including potters, weavers, and metal workers, lived in specific neighbourhoods where they practiced their trades. The Chimú economy relied heavily on agriculture and fishing. They expanded and maintained the irrigation systems built by the Moche, adding new canals and extending water distribution networks. The most ambitious Chimú project was the Intervalley Canal, which attempted to bring water from the Chicama Valley to the Moche Valley, a distance of about 50 miles. The canal was never completed, possibly due to engineering difficulties or political disruption, but the attempt shows the scale of Chimú hydraulic engineering. Chimú farmers grew maize, beans, squash, peanuts, cotton, and various fruits. They practiced intensive agriculture, using fertilizer from seabird guano collected from offshore islands. The Humboldt Current created ideal conditions for huge populations of seabirds whose droppings accumulated on rocky islands in thick deposits. This guano is extremely rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, making it an excellent fertilizer. The Chimú gathered guano and applied it to their fields, significantly increasing agricultural yields. Fishing remained important to the Chimú economy. Fishermen used reed boats called cabalitos de totora, made from bundles of reeds lashed together. These boats, still used by fishermen in some areas today, were light enough to be carried but sturdy enough to handle ocean waves. Fishermen caught anchovies, mackerel, bonito, and other fish, which were consumed fresh, dried, or traded inland. Chimú craftspeople were highly skilled. Chimú metal workers produced some of the finest metalwork in the ancient Andes. They worked with gold, silver, copper, and bronze, creating jewelry, ceremonial objects, tools, and weapons. Chimú metalsmiths developed sophisticated techniques, including lost wax casting, alloying, plating, and gilding. Some objects were made by joining many small pieces together to create elaborate designs. Chimú textiles also showed high quality. Weavers created fabrics with complex patterns using multiple techniques, including tapestry, brocade, and gauze weaves. Some textiles featured featherwork, with hundreds of tiny feathers attached to create colourful designs. These feather textiles were extremely valuable and were worn only by the elite. Chimú pottery, while less diverse than Moche ceramics, maintained high standards. Chimú potters typically made blackware, ceramics with a distinctive black surface achieved by firing in a reducing atmosphere. Common forms included stirrup spout bottles, jars with pressed relief decoration, and whistling bottles that produced sounds when liquid was poured. The Chimú kingdom expanded through conquest. At its greatest extent, the Chimú controlled roughly 600 miles of coastline and the adjacent river valleys. Each valley was administered from a provincial centre, often a smaller version of Chan, with high-walled compounds and administrative buildings. Local leaders were incorporated into the Chimú administrative hierarchy, allowed to maintain their positions as long as they acknowledged Chimú overlordship and provided tribute. Around 600 years ago, the Chimú kingdom faced a new threat from the highlands. The Inca Empire, expanding from its centre in Cusco, began conquering neighbouring regions. Around 540 years ago, Inca armies under the Emperor Topa Inca Yupanqui invaded Chimú territory. Despite fierce resistance, the Chimú were eventually conquered. The Inca captured the Chimú king, Minchansaman, and brought him to Cusco as a honoured but powerless prisoner. Chan was occupied by Inca administrators, though the city continued to function. Chimú craftspeople were taken to Cusco to work for the Inca elite, spreading Chimú artistic techniques throughout the empire. Part 8. The Inca Empire emerges. The Inca Empire, which would become the largest native state in the Americas, had humble beginnings. According to Inca legend, the first Inca ruler, Manco Capac, founded the city of Cusco around 800 years ago. For the first few centuries, the Inca were just one of many small ethnic groups in the Cusco region, competing with neighbouring chiefdoms for land and resources. Archaeological evidence suggests the early Inca were indeed a relatively minor polity. Cusco, during this period, was a modest town, not much different from other highland communities. The Inca survived by farming the fertile valley surrounding their capital, growing potatoes, maize, and quinoa. They also herded llamas and alpacas, which provided wool, meat, and transportation. The transformation of the Inca from a regional power to an empire began in the early 1400s under the ruler Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. According to Inca histories recorded by Spanish chroniclers, Pachacuti came to power during a crisis. The neighbouring Chanca people attacked Cusco, and the reigning Inca ruler fled. Pachacuti, then a prince, rallied the defence and defeated the Chanca. This victory gave him the prestige and authority to seize power and begin a program of expansion. Under Pachacuti and his successors, the Inca embarked on a century of rapid conquest. Pachacuti conquered the region around Lake Titicaca, incorporating the descendants of the Tiwanaku culture. His son, Topa Inca Yupanqui expanded the empire even further, conquering the Chimú kingdom on the coast and extending Inca control into Ecuador and Chile. Topa's son, Huayna Capac, pushed the borders even further, reaching into what is now southern Colombia. The speed of Inca expansion was remarkable. In less than 100 years, the Inca created an empire stretching for over 2,500 miles along the Andes, from southern Colombia to central Chile. This territory encompassed diverse environments, from coastal deserts to high mountain valleys to the edge of the Amazon rainforest. The population of the empire may have numbered between 6 million and 12 million people, speaking dozens of different languages and practicing various cultural traditions. How did the Inca create and maintain such a vast empire? Military force was certainly important. The Inca army was well organized and equipped with effective weapons, including slings, spears, clubs, and bows. Soldiers were recruited from throughout the empire through a labor tax system. However, the Inca also used diplomacy, offering potential subjects a choice: submit peacefully and enjoy the benefits of Inca protection and administration, or resist and face military conquest. Many groups chose to submit, calculating that Inca rule offered advantages. The Inca promised to protect subject peoples from their enemies, to redistribute resources during famines, and to include local elites in the imperial hierarchy. Local leaders who cooperated were confirmed in their positions, and sometimes rewarded with gifts, prestigious titles, and secondary wives from the Inca royal family. Their sons were brought to Cuzco to be educated, both as a privilege and as hostages, ensuring their father's loyalty. The Inca administrative system was sophisticated. The empire was divided into 4 quarters called suyus, each administered by a high-ranking official. These quarters were further subdivided into provinces, each with its own governor. Provinces were divided into smaller units based on population, with officials responsible for groups of 10,000, 1,000, 100, and 10 households. A crucial element of Inca administration was the mita, a labor tax. Instead of paying tribute in goods, subject peoples owed labor service to the state. Men could be called up to work on state projects, building roads, constructing temples, serving in the army, or farming state lands. Women might be required to weave textiles for the state. The mita system allowed the Inca to mobilize massive labor forces for public works projects. The Inca built an extensive road system connecting all parts of their empire. 2 main roads ran the length of the empire, one along the coast and one through the highlands, with numerous cross routes linking them. The total road network may have extended over 24,000 miles. These weren't simple trails, they were engineered highways with stone paving, drainage systems, steps carved into steep slopes, and bridges spanning rivers and gorges. Inca bridges were engineering marvels. Suspension bridges made from braided grass ropes spanned deep gorges. These bridges had to be rebuilt annually as the ropes deteriorated, a task performed by local communities as part of their mita obligation. Some of these bridges spanned distances of over 150 feet. The chronicler Pedro Pizarro described seeing an Inca suspension bridge and marveling at its construction. Along the roads, the Inca built way stations called tambos, spaced about a day's journey apart. These provided shelter and supplies for travelers on official business. The roads also featured chasqui stations. Chasquis were relay runners who carried messages throughout the empire. A message could travel from Cuzco to Quito, a distance of over 1,000 miles, in about a week, an impressive speed for a non-literate society. The Inca administration required detailed record-keeping, which they accomplished using quipus. These were complex arrangements of knotted strings that recorded numerical information and possibly other data. Specialized officials called quipucamayos maintained these records, tracking populations, tribute obligations, and resources. While we can read the numerical information in quipus, other types of information they may have encoded remain undeciphered. The Inca economy was based on principles different from market-based systems. There was no money in the Inca Empire, and markets were limited. Instead, the economy operated through reciprocity and redistribution. The state owned vast lands, herds, and resources. Commoners worked these state resources as part of their labor tax, and in return, the state redistributed goods to feed workers, support the aristocracy, sponsor ceremonies, and provide for the poor and disabled. Agricultural production was organized efficiently. The Inca built extensive terracing systems on mountain slopes, creating level planting surfaces and preventing erosion. Some terrace systems covered hundreds of acres and involved moving millions of cubic feet of earth and stone. The terraces were irrigated through carefully designed canal systems that brought water from streams and springs. Different crops were grown at different altitudes, taking advantage of the various microclimates created by the mountainous terrain. The Inca also maintained state storehouses throughout the empire. These kolkars held surplus food, textiles, weapons, and other goods. During famines or emergencies, the state could distribute these resources to afflicted regions. This system provided a form of insurance against crop failures and environmental disasters. Inca religion was complex, incorporating both their own traditions and beliefs of conquered peoples. The most important deity was Inti, the sun god, considered the ancestor of the Inca rulers. The Coricancha, the main temple in Cuzco, was dedicated to Inti. Its walls were covered with gold sheets, and a massive gold disc representing the sun dominated the main chamber. Other important deities included Mamaquilla, the moon goddess, Ilapa, the thunder god, and Pachamama, the earth mother. The Inca also venerated sacred places called huacas. These could be natural features like mountains, springs, or unusual rock formations, or human-made objects like temples and monuments. The most important huacas were pilgrimage sites where people came to make offerings and request divine favor. The Inca believed mountains were particularly powerful huacas, and they performed ceremonies on high peaks, sometimes including human sacrifice. Part 9. Inca, Society and Culture. Inca society was highly stratified. At the top stood the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered semi-divine, descended from Inti, the sun god. The Sapa Inca had absolute authority over the empire. He lived in luxury, wore the finest clothes, and was carried on a litter when he travelled. Only the highest nobles could speak to him directly, and even they had to approach him carrying a symbolic burden on their backs as a sign of respect. Below the Sapa Inca stood the Inca aristocracy, members of the royal family, and descendants of previous emperors. This group, numbering perhaps a few thousand people, held the most important positions in government, the army, and the priesthood. They enjoyed privileges denied to commoners living in fine houses, wearing special clothing, and owning land and resources. A broader noble class included the local leaders of conquered peoples who had been incorporated into the Inca system. These nobles, called curacas, administered their regions under Inca oversight. They collected tribute, organized labor levies, and maintained order. In return, they enjoyed higher status and received gifts from the state. The vast majority of the population were commoners, called hatun runa. These were farmers, herders, and craftspeople who supported the empire through their labor. Commoners lived in simple houses, wore plain clothing, and had limited access to luxury goods. However, Inca ideology emphasized reciprocity, the idea that the relationship between rulers and ruled involved mutual obligations. While commoners owed labor to the state was supposed to provide for their welfare, redistributing resources and protecting them from harm. At the bottom of Inca society were the yanacuna, full-time servants who worked directly for the state or for noble households. These individuals were removed from their home communities and assigned to specific tasks. Some became craftspeople, producing luxury goods for the elite. Others worked as farmers on state lands or as servants in noble households. While they lost their place in their original communities, some yanacuna achieved relatively high status through their service. Inca family structure was based on the Ailu, a kinship group that owned land communally and worked together on agricultural and other tasks. Members of an Ailu considered themselves descendants of a common ancestor. The Ailu distributed land among its members, organized collective work projects, and maintained social order. Reciprocal labor exchanges were common, with community members helping each other with tasks like building houses, harvesting crops, or celebrating life events. Marriage was nearly universal in Inca society. The state actually encouraged marriage, and annual ceremonies were held where young men and women who had reached marriageable age were paired up. While individuals could express preferences, officials often made the final decisions, especially for commoners. For nobles, marriage was more complex, often serving to create political alliances. The Inca practiced polygyny, but in a highly stratified way. The Sapa Inca had many wives, including his primary wife, who was usually his sister, following the practice of royal sibling marriage to maintain the purity of the sacred bloodline. He also married women from noble families throughout the empire, creating kinship ties with local elites. Wealthy nobles might have several wives, while commoners were generally limited to one. Women in Inca society had clearly defined roles, but these weren't necessarily inferior to men's roles. Women were responsible for weaving, an extremely important activity in Inca culture. Textiles served as a form of wealth and were offered to gods, given as gifts, and used to display status. The finest textiles were woven by specialists called aclacuna, chosen women who lived in special compounds and devoted themselves to weaving and religious service. Some chosen women served in temples, maintaining fires, preparing ritual foods, and participating in ceremonies. The most beautiful might become secondary wives of the Sapa Inca, or be given as wives to nobles he wished to honor. Others remained in the Akalawasi, the houses of chosen women throughout their lives, devoted to religious service and textile production. Inca architecture reflected both practical concerns and ideological messages. Inca buildings were constructed from stone, using techniques that varied from rough fieldstone for common structures to finely fitted ashlar masonry for important buildings. The finest Inca stonework found at sites like Machu Picchu and the Coricancha in Cusco features massive blocks cut to fit together perfectly without mortar. The precision is remarkable, with joints so tight that a knife blade can't fit between the stones. How did Inca masons achieve this precision? They used stone and bronze tools to shape the blocks, working slowly and carefully. They may have used templates to guide their cutting and repeatedly fitted blocks together, removing material until the fit was perfect. The process was time-consuming, but the results were buildings of exceptional stability, many of which have survived earthquakes that destroyed later Spanish colonial structures built on top of them. Inca buildings often featured trapezoidal forms, with doorways, windows, and niches wider at the base than at the top. This shape may have had structural advantages, distributing weight more evenly and providing earthquake resistance. It also created a distinctive Inca aesthetic that marked their buildings as different from those of earlier cultures. The most famous Inca site is Machu Picchu, the mountaintop estate built by Pachacuti around 560 to 570 years ago. Machu Picchu sits at an altitude of nearly 8,000 feet, perched on a ridge between two peaks. The site includes about 200 structures, temples, palaces, residential buildings, and agricultural terraces. The stonework is exceptional, with finely fitted blocks and sophisticated drainage systems to handle the heavy rainfall the area receives. Machu Picchu's purpose has been much debated. It may have been a royal estate where Pachacuti and his court retreated from Cuzco. The site's remote location and impressive setting would have demonstrated the emperor's power and his connection to the sacred mountains. Alternatively, or additionally, Machu Picchu may have had religious significance, serving as a center for ceremonies dedicated to mountain deities. Inca craft production reached high levels of sophistication. Weavers created textiles with intricate patterns and vibrant colors, using cotton and wool from llamas, alpacas, and vicuñas. Different weaving techniques produced various types of fabric, from plain weaves for everyday clothing to complex tapestries for ceremonial use. The finest textiles, called kumbi, were woven from vicuña wool by the Aclacuna. These fabrics were so valuable that they were used as prestige gifts and offerings to the gods. Inca metalworkers were highly skilled, though they didn't develop ironworking technology, which wasn't known in the Americas before European contact. They worked primarily with gold, silver, copper, and bronze. Gold and silver were considered sacred, associated with the sun and moon respectively. Metal workers created jewelry, ceremonial objects, and decorative items for temples and palaces. They used techniques including hammering, casting, soldering, and alloying. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was used for tools and weapons. Inca bronze smiths created axes, knives, agricultural tools, and weapons. Bronze tools were harder and more durable than pure copper, making them more effective for cutting and shaping stone. Inca pottery, while competent, was less artistically elaborate than that of some earlier cultures. The Inca emphasized standardized, functional forms. The most characteristic Inca vessel is the arribalos, a large jar with a pointed base used for storing and transporting liquids, especially chicha, maize beer. These vessels were carried on the back using a rope through the handles, with the pointed base resting against the carrier's back. Chicha played an important role in Inca society. This mildly alcoholic beverage made from fermented maize was consumed at festivals, offered to gods, and used in reciprocal exchanges. Important ceremonies often involved ritual drinking of chicha, with the Sapa Inca and high officials drinking from ornate cups called keros. Part 10. The Spanish Conquest. At its height in the early 1500s, the Inca Empire was the largest state in the Americas. Then, in 1532, a small group of Spanish conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru. Within a few years, the empire had collapsed, and the Inca had become subjects of the Spanish crown. How did this happen? The conquest occurred during a period of internal turmoil. Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca, died around 1527, possibly from smallpox or another European disease that had spread to Peru ahead of the Spaniards themselves. Huayna Capac's death triggered a succession crisis. Two of his sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, both claimed the throne. Huascar controlled Cuzco and the southern part of the empire, while Atahualpa commanded the army in the north. A civil war erupted, lasting several years and causing great destruction. Atahualpa's forces eventually defeated Huascar's army and captured Huascar himself. Atahualpa was in the northern city of Cajamarca celebrating his victory when news arrived of strange bearded men landing on the coast. These were Pizarro and his expedition. Pizarro's force was tiny, only about 168 men. However, they possessed significant advantages. They had horses which terrified people who had never seen such animals. They had steel swords, armour, and a few firearms and cannons. They also had knowledge of Inca society gained from captured interpreters and previous coastal expeditions. Most importantly, they arrived at a moment of maximum Inca vulnerability, with the empire divided by civil war and the population devastated by epidemic disease. Atahualpa, confident in his power and curious about the strangers, agreed to meet Pizarro at Cajamarca. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa entered the city's central plaza, carried on a golden litter and surrounded by thousands of attendants. A Spanish friar approached and invited Atahualpa to accept Christianity and submit to Spanish authority. Atahualpa rejected these demands. At a signal from Pizarro, the Spanish attacked. The Battle of Cajamarca was a massacre. The Spanish cavalry charged into the crowded plaza, while soldiers fired guns and cannons. The Inca attendants, mostly unarmed ceremonial guards, were slaughtered. Thousands died in the panic and confusion. Atahualpa was captured, pulled from his litter, and held prisoner. Atahualpa attempted to ransom himself. He offered to fill a room with gold and another with silver. Over the following months, his followers brought treasure from throughout the empire, melting down precious objects and transporting the metal to Cajamarca. The Spanish received an enormous quantity of gold and silver, which they promptly melted down into bars for easier transport, destroying countless works of art in the process. Despite receiving the ransom, the Spanish refused to release Atahualpa. They feared that a free Atahualpa would organize resistance. In July 1533, They held a show trial, convicted him of various crimes, and executed him by strangulation. With Atahualpa dead, the Spanish marched on Cusco. They encountered resistance but also found allies among ethnic groups that resented Inca rule or hoped to use the Spanish to their own advantage. In November 1533, the Spanish entered Cusco without a fight. They installed a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, a son of Huayna Capac. Initially, Manco cooperated with the Spanish, hoping to use them to consolidate his power, but he soon realized the Spanish intended to rule directly, not simply replace the Sapa Inca. Spanish soldiers abused the population, looted temples and palaces, and showed disrespect for Inca religion and customs. In 1536, Manco escaped from Spanish custody and organized a massive rebellion. Manco's forces besieged Cusco, nearly recapturing the city. Fierce fighting raged for months, with the Spanish barely holding out. Eventually, Spanish reinforcements arrived, and the siege was broken. Manco retreated to the remote region of Vilcabamba, where he established a neo-Inca state that continued to resist Spanish rule for another 36 years. The Spanish conquest succeeded for several reasons. Disease was crucial. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases devastated the indigenous population, killing millions and disrupting social organization. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa weakened the empire at a critical moment. Spanish military technology, particularly horses and steel weapons, provided tactical advantages, and the Spanish effectively exploited divisions within the empire, allying with groups that opposed Inca rule. The Spanish established colonial rule over Peru, creating the viceroyalty of Peru, which would last until independence in the early 1800s. They reorganized the economy around mining, particularly silver mining at Potosi, which became one of the richest silver mines in the world. The Spanish forced indigenous people to work in the mines through the meter system, a labor draft that nominally drew on the Inca meter tradition but was far more exploitative and deadly. The colonial period brought catastrophic demographic collapse. Epidemic diseases, harsh labor conditions, social disruption, and violence reduced the indigenous population by perhaps 80 to 90% within a century of contact. Entire communities disappeared. Languages went extinct. Cultural traditions were suppressed by Spanish authorities and Catholic missionaries who sought to convert the population to Christianity. However, indigenous cultures proved resilient. People adapted, combining Spanish and indigenous elements to create new cultural forms. Quechua, the Inca language, survived and is still spoken by millions today. Agricultural traditions, textile techniques, and other practices continued, and the memory of the Inca Empire remained alive, becoming a source of pride and identity for indigenous peoples, and later for Peruvian national identity. Part 11. Daily Life in the Ancient Andes. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into the routines, challenges, and experiences of ordinary people, not just the rulers and priests whose monuments dominate the landscape. For a coastal fisherman in a Norte Chico community 5,000 years ago, the day would begin before sunrise. He would wake in his simple dwelling, perhaps a structure of cane and mud, and prepare his fishing nets woven from cotton fibre. The nets were crucial technology, requiring careful maintenance and repair. Walking to the beach, he would join other fishermen, launching their reed boats into the Pacific. The ocean was generous, but also dangerous. Understanding currents, tides, and weather was essential for survival. The fishing itself required skill and patience. Anchovies moved in vast schools, and knowing where and when to cast the nets meant the difference between a good catch and an empty boat. A successful fisherman might bring home dozens of pounds of fish, enough to feed his family with surplus to trade for agricultural products from inland communities. The dried fish could be stored or carried long distances, making them valuable trade goods. Returning to shore, the fisherman would clean and prepare his catch. Some fish would be eaten fresh, perhaps roasted over a fire or cooked in a gourd with heated stones. Others would be gutted and laid out to dry in the intense desert sun, a preservation method that allowed fish to be stored for months. The bones, scales, and offal wouldn't be wasted. They could be used as fertilizer for the small gardens families maintained near their homes. In the river valleys behind the coastal strip, farming families lived quite different lives. A farmer in the Moche Valley around 1,500 years ago would wake to the sound of irrigation water flowing through canals. Water management was a constant concern. Too little water meant crops would wither. Too much could wash away fields or cause destructive floods. The elaborate system of canals, reservoirs, and distribution channels required continuous maintenance, a task organized through communal labor. Maize cultivation followed a seasonal rhythm. Fields had to be prepared, seeds planted at the right time, crops weeded and watered throughout the growing season, and finally harvested. The harvest was a community event, with families working together and celebrating with feasting and ritual observances. A portion of the harvest would be set aside as offering to the gods who controlled rain and fertility. Another portion would go to the local elite as tribute. The remainder would feed the family through the year, with surplus stored against future need or used for trade. Women's work centered on food preparation and textile production. Grinding maize into flour was laborious, done by hand on stone grinding slabs called batans. The grinding motion, repeated thousands of times, left characteristic wear patterns on the bones of women's arms, which archaeologists can detect in skeletal remains. Cooking involved managing fires, preparing stews and porridges, and sometimes brewing chicha, the fermented maize beer that played important social and ritual roles. Textile production consumed enormous amounts of time. Women spun cotton or wool into thread using drop spindles, a process requiring skill to create even, strong thread. The spinning might be done while performing other tasks, during conversations, or while watching children. Weaving happened on backstrap looms, portable devices where one end was tied to a fixed point and the other attached to a strap around the weaver's waist. Creating even a simple piece of cloth took many hours. Complex patterns with multiple colours required exceptional skill and concentration. Children in ancient Peruvian societies began learning adult roles at young ages. Boys accompanied fathers to fields or fishing expeditions, gradually taking on more responsibility. Girls learned spinning, weaving, and food preparation from mothers and other women. Play certainly occurred, but from age 6 or 7, most children contributed meaningfully to household subsistence. Life in the highlands presented different challenges and routines. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, the thin air made physical exertion more difficult. Crops grew more slowly, and the risk of frost damage meant the growing season was short. Highland farmers developed varieties of potatoes and other crops specifically adapted to high altitudes. Some potato varieties could survive light frosts, while others were deliberately left in the fields to freeze, then processed into chunyo, freeze-dried potatoes that could be stored for years. Herding llamas and alpacas was central to highland economies. Herders moved their animals seasonally, following the growth of fresh pasture. Young boys often served as herders, spending days in the high grasslands watching over the animals, protecting them from predators, and ensuring they didn't wander too far. It was lonely work, but crucial to the community's welfare. The animals provided wool for textiles, meat for special occasions, and served as pack animals for trade goods. In the high grasslands called puna, the environment was harsh, but not without beauty. The air was crystal clear, allowing views for dozens of miles. At night, the stars blazed with an intensity rarely seen at lower elevations. The people who lived in these regions understood their environment intimately. They knew which plants had medicinal properties, which could be eaten, which provided materials for tools or construction. They read the behavior of animals to predict weather changes. They knew the land's moods and rhythms. Craft specialists lived different lives again. A potter in a Moche workshop would spend days preparing clay, mixing different types of earth to achieve the right consistency. Forming vessels on a slow wheel or by hand required years of practice to master. Painting the elaborate scenes that decorated fine pottery demanded artistic skill and knowledge of the iconographic conventions. Firing the pots was perhaps the most nerve-wracking moment. A kiln loaded with days of work could be ruined by incorrect temperatures or poor oxygen control. Metal workers faced similar challenges. Creating bronze required obtaining copper and tin, sometimes from sources hundreds of miles apart, then carefully controlling the proportions and working temperatures. Casting objects using the lost wax method involved multiple steps, each requiring precision. A single mistake could ruin weeks of work. Yet when successful, the craftsperson created objects of beauty and utility that brought prestige and value. Weavers creating the finest textiles worked under even greater constraints. Kumbi cloth, the highest grade of Inca textile, had thread counts exceeding 100 threads per inch. Creating such fabric required perfect tension and extraordinary patience. A single square foot might take weeks to complete. These textiles were more valuable than gold, reserved for the elite and for offerings to the gods. Religious practitioners played crucial roles in ancient Peruvian communities. A priest at a Chavín temple would undergo years of training, learning the sacred songs, rituals, and knowledge passed down through generations. Priests might study the movements of stars and planets, tracking celestial cycles for agricultural and ceremonial calendars. They maintained temples, prepared offerings, conducted ceremonies, and interceded with supernatural forces on behalf of the community. Some ceremonies involved altered states of consciousness, induced by fasting, meditation, or the consumption of psychoactive plants. The San Pedro cactus, containing mescaline, grows throughout Peru and has been used in Andean spiritual practices for thousands of years. A priest guiding others through a vision quest would himself have experienced many such journeys, learning to navigate the strange landscapes of altered consciousness and interpret the visions encountered there. Traders formed another important group. A merchant carrying goods between coast and highlands would undertake journeys lasting weeks or months. Llama caravans moved slowly, covering perhaps 10 to 15 miles per day. The routes crossed deserts, climbed mountain passes, and descended into valleys. Traders needed to know where water sources existed, where they could find fodder for their animals, and which communities would welcome them for trade or might pose dangers. The goods carried by these traders connected disparate regions in networks of exchange. Shells from the coast moved to the highlands. Obsidian from highland volcanic sources reached the coast. Coca leaves from the eastern slopes of the Andes, where the mountains descend into the Amazon basin, were traded widely for their stimulant properties. Trade wasn't just economic, it spread ideas, artistic styles, and information across vast distances. Warriors in Moche and other coastal societies trained extensively with weapons. Slings could hurl stones with deadly force. Spears required strength and accuracy. Clubs designed to crush bones demanded both power and skill. Warriors wore elaborate costumes, including ornate helmets, tunics covered with metal discs, and carried large shields. Combat was ritualized to some degree, with warriors seeking to capture prisoners rather than kill enemies outright, at least in some contexts. Captured warriors faced grim fates. Moche art depicts prisoners being ritually sacrificed, their throats cut and blood collected in ceremonial vessels. These sacrifices appear to have been offerings to gods, perhaps to ensure agricultural fertility or success in future conflicts. The victims were sometimes taken to high mountains and killed there, their bodies left as offerings to mountain deities. Musicians and artists also held important positions. Archaeologists have found many musical instruments in ancient Peruvian sites, flutes made from bone or ceramic, panpipes, trumpets made from large shells, and drums of various sizes. Music accompanied ceremonies, festivals, and probably daily activities. We can only imagine what this music sounded like, but it certainly played a role in creating community cohesion and expressing cultural identity. Artists created works that went beyond functional needs. The elaborate pottery, textiles, and metalwork of ancient Peru show aesthetic sensibilities and creative vision. Artists made choices about composition, colour, and form that transformed utilitarian objects into works of beauty. These choices reflected cultural values, religious beliefs, and individual creativity. Elderly people in ancient Peruvian societies were repositories of knowledge. In societies without writing, the memories of elders preserved history, mythology, and practical knowledge. An old farmer might remember droughts from 50 years earlier and could advise on water conservation based on that experience. An elderly weaver knew thousands of patterns and techniques accumulated over a lifetime. Storytellers preserved myths and legends that explained the world and taught moral lessons. Death and burial practices varied across cultures and time periods. The Paracas culture on the south coast created elaborate mummy bundles, wrapping the deceased in layers of textiles. Some mummy bundles contained dozens of textile layers, representing an enormous investment of labour and resources. The Chinchorro culture, which predated the Norte Chico, practiced mummification even earlier, carefully preserving bodies through removal of organs and artificial preservation techniques. The Inca preserved the bodies of dead rulers, treating them as if still alive. A deceased emperor's mummy would be brought out for festivals, dressed in fine clothes, offered food and drink, and consulted on important decisions. This practice meant each new ruler had to acquire his own lands and resources, as the property of deceased emperors continued to support their mummies and descendants. Disease and injury were constants of ancient life. Without modern medicine, infections from minor wounds could be fatal. Childbirth was dangerous for both mothers and infants. Archaeological skeletal remains show evidence of various health problems. Arthritis affected many older individuals, likely resulting from lives of hard physical labour. Dental health was often poor, with cavities and abscesses causing pain and sometimes fatal infections. Yet ancient Peruvians had medical knowledge. They practiced trepanation, surgically opening the skull, possibly to treat head injuries or relieve pressure. Remarkably, many individuals survived these operations, as evidenced by bone regrowth around the openings. They used medicinal plants, many of which are still used in traditional medicine today. Coca leaves were chewed to suppress hunger and fatigue. Cinchona bark, containing quinine, treated fevers. Various herbs served as painkillers, antiseptics, or treatments for specific ailments. Natural disasters periodically disrupted ancient Peruvian life. Earthquakes were common along the coast, where the Nazca tectonic plate subducts beneath the South American plate. Tsunamis could devastate coastal communities. El Niño events brought catastrophic flooding and disrupted marine ecosystems. Droughts could last for years, destroying crops and causing famines. Volcanic eruptions, while less frequent, could cover large areas with ash. Communities responded to these disasters through mutual aid, stored resources, and religious rituals. The Inca system of state storehouses and redistribution was partly designed to buffer against local disasters. When one region suffered crop failure, resources from other areas could be sent to prevent starvation. This system worked reasonably well, though it depended on effective administration and rulers willing to fulfill their reciprocal obligations. Festivals and ceremonies provided breaks from daily routines and reinforced community bonds. The Inca celebrated numerous festivals throughout the year, many tied to agricultural cycles. Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun held at the winter solstice, was one of the most important. The ceremony reaffirmed the Inca ruler's connection to Inti, the sun god, and symbolically renewed the world for another year. Common people participated in these festivals through required attendance, provision of food and goods, and sometimes performance of dances or songs. While the elite wore the finest costumes and played central roles, festivals were communal events that brought together people from various social levels. They featured feasting, music, dancing, and ritual drinking of chicha. For ordinary people who spent most of their time working, these occasions offered entertainment, social interaction, and spiritual renewal. Part 12. Archaeological discoveries and methods. Our knowledge of ancient Peru comes from over a century of archaeological research. The story of how archaeologists uncovered these civilizations is itself fascinating, filled with remarkable discoveries, painstaking analysis, and evolving methods. Early interest in Peru's ancient past came from chroniclers during the Spanish colonial period. Writers like Pedro Cieza de Leon, Bernabe Cobo, and Garcilaso de la Vega recorded information about Inca culture and, to a lesser extent, pre-Inca civilizations. These chronicles, while valuable, were written decades or centuries after the conquest and often reflected Spanish biases or misunderstandings. Archaeological research would be needed to move beyond these texts. Serious archaeological work in Peru began in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Max Uhle, a German archaeologist, conducted systematic excavations at sites on the central coast in the 1890s. He recognized that different styles of pottery came from different time periods, establishing a chronological framework that subsequent researchers would refine. Uhle's work demonstrated that Inca civilization was preceded by older cultures, contradicting earlier assumptions that the Inca represented Peru's first complex society. Julio C. Tello, Peru's first major indigenous archaeologist, made crucial discoveries in the early 1900s. In 1919, he excavated at Chavín de Huántar, revealing the Lanzón and other remarkable sculptures. Tello recognized Chavín as a very old culture that had influenced a wide area. His work at Paracas uncovered elaborate mummy bundles wrapped in beautiful textiles. Tello's research helped establish the great antiquity and diversity of Peruvian civilizations. The discovery of the Lord of Sipan in 1987 represented a watershed moment. Archaeologist Walter Alva received word that looters had found a rich tomb at Huaca Rajada in northern Peru. Alva rushed to the site and convinced authorities to protect it. His subsequent excavation revealed not only the Lord of Sipan's burial, but several other elite tombs containing spectacular offerings. The discovery demonstrated that much remained to be learned about ancient Peru and showed that careful scientific excavation could produce far more information than looting ever could. Ruth Shady's work at Caral, beginning in the 1990s, revolutionized understanding of early Peruvian civilization. When she began excavations, the conventional date for the appearance of complex society in Peru was around 3,800 years ago. Shady's radiocarbon dates from Caral placed major construction there between 5,000 and 4,600 years ago, pushing back the origins of Peruvian civilization by over 1,000 years and making it contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia. Modern archaeological methods combine traditional excavation with cutting-edge science. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials, allows precise dating of sites and artifacts. The method works on materials like wood, textiles, bone, and plant remains, providing dates accurate to within a few decades for materials less than 50,000 years old. Remote sensing technologies have transformed how archaeologists find and study sites. Aerial photography reveals features invisible from the ground. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create detailed topographic maps, can detect archaeological remains hidden under forest canopy. Satellite imagery helps identify ancient roads, field systems, and settlement patterns across vast areas. Ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves into the earth and analyzes the reflections to detect buried features. This non-invasive technique can locate buried architecture, tombs, and other features without excavation. Magnetometry detects variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried features, helping archaeologists map sites before digging. DNA analysis has opened new windows into the past. By extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient bones and mummies, researchers can trace population movements, identify family relationships, and even detect diseases. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line, has revealed that indigenous Americans descended from populations that migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth provides information about diet and geographic origin. Different ratios of carbon isotopes in bone indicate what types of plants a person ate. Strontium isotopes in tooth enamel reflect the geology of the region where someone grew up. By combining these analyses, researchers can determine if individuals were local to the site where they were buried or if they migrated from elsewhere. Residue analysis examines microscopic remains on pottery and stone tools to determine how they were used. Lipid residues from foods absorbed into pottery can identify what was cooked in specific vessels. Starch grains and phytoliths on grinding stones reveal which plants were processed. Blood residues on weapons and tools can be identified, showing what animals were hunted. Experimental archaeology involves recreating ancient technologies to understand how things were made and used. Archaeologists have woven textiles using ancient techniques, cast bronze objects following traditional methods, and constructed buildings with prehistoric tools and methods. These experiments provide insights into the time, skill, and resources required for various activities. The preservation conditions in Peru's coastal desert have provided archaeologists with unusually rich materials. The extreme aridity means organic materials that would decay elsewhere survive for thousands of years. Textiles, wooden objects, plant remains, and even mummified bodies preserve in remarkable detail. This has allowed researchers to study ancient textiles, wooden tools, foods, and other perishable materials that rarely survive at sites in wetter climates. One famous example of this preservation is the mummies of the Chinchorro culture, which developed along the northern Chilean and southern Peruvian coast. The Chinchorro practiced artificial mummification as early as 7,000 years ago, making their mummies the oldest in the world, older than Egyptian mummies by several millennia. The dry climate preserved these mummies, allowing detailed study of the embalming techniques and the physical characteristics of the deceased. At highland sites like Machu Picchu, the remarkable quality of Inca stone masonry has allowed buildings to survive for over 500 years despite earthquakes and weathering. This preservation lets archaeologists study Inca architecture in detail, analysing construction techniques, architectural planning, and even subtle details like the alignment of buildings with astronomical features. Underwater archaeology has also contributed to our understanding. Peru's coast includes many submerged sites, some resulting from sea level changes, others from natural disasters like tsunamis. Archaeologists have explored these underwater sites, recovering artifacts and information about maritime cultures. The analysis of ancient sites increasingly involves interdisciplinary collaboration. Archaeologists work with geologists to understand site formation processes and past environmental conditions. Climate scientists help reconstruct ancient weather patterns. Botanists identify plant remains and study ancient agriculture. Zoologists analyze animal bones to understand hunting, herding, and diet. Chemists analyze pottery, metals, and residues. This collaborative approach produces rich, multifaceted understanding of the past. Ethical considerations have become increasingly important in archaeology. In the past, archaeologists often removed artifacts and even human remains from Peru for study and display in foreign museums. Today, most nations, including Peru, have laws requiring that archaeological materials remain in the country. Archaeologists work closely with local communities and indigenous groups, recognizing their interests in and connections to ancient sites. The repatriation of human remains and sacred objects has become a significant issue. Many museums have returned Peruvian mummies and artifacts to Peru. Within Peru, debates continue about the treatment of ancient human remains. Should they be displayed in museums for educational purposes, or should they be reburied with appropriate ceremonies? These questions involve balancing scientific interest with respect for the dead and the concerns of descendant communities. Looting remains a serious problem. The international market for ancient Peruvian artifacts creates incentives for looters to excavate sites illegally, often destroying valuable archaeological context in the process. When objects are looted, the information about where they were found, what they were associated with, and when they date to is often lost forever. Law enforcement agencies and archaeologists work to combat looting, but the problem persists. Conservation of archaeological sites presents ongoing challenges. Sites are threatened by urban expansion, agricultural development, climate change, and natural disasters. The Peruvian government, working with international organizations and archaeologists, has established protections for important sites and created archaeological parks where sites can be preserved and presented to the public. Tourism brings both benefits and problems. Sites like Machu Picchu attract millions of visitors annually, generating revenue that can support conservation and local economies. However, heavy tourism also causes wear on ancient structures and can damage fragile archaeological materials. Managing this balance is an ongoing challenge. Part 13. Legacy and Conclusion. The civilizations of ancient Peru created remarkable achievements. Over thousands of years, diverse cultures adapted to challenging environments, from the driest deserts to the highest mountains. They developed sophisticated agricultural systems, including irrigation, terracing, and raised fields. They built monumental architecture, from the pyramids of Caral to the stone masonry of Machu Picchu. They created beautiful textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. They established complex political systems, from the theocratic center of Chavín to the administrative empire of the Inca. These achievements were accomplished without many technologies considered essential elsewhere. Ancient Peruvian peoples had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals beyond llamas, and no iron tools. They never developed a writing system, though they did create record-keeping systems like the Quipu. Despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, they developed unique solutions to problems of organization, production, and social cohesion. The Inca Empire represented the culmination of thousands of years of cultural development in the Andes. The Inca built on traditions established by earlier cultures, incorporating agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and organizational principles developed by the Moche, Chimú, Wari, Tiwanaku, and others. They created the largest native empire in the Americas, administering a vast territory with diverse populations and environments through an efficient bureaucracy extensive road system, and sophisticated record keeping. The Spanish conquest brought this trajectory to an abrupt end. The colonial period introduced new social structures, economic systems, and cultural practices. But the indigenous heritage didn't disappear. Today, millions of people in Peru and neighboring countries speak Quechua or Aymara. Traditional agricultural practices continue. Textile weavers maintain techniques passed down through generations, and the archaeological remains of ancient civilizations, from Caral to Machu Picchu, attract scholars and visitors from around the world. Studying ancient Peru reminds us that human societies can develop in multiple ways. The civilizations of the Andes followed a path quite different from those of Europe, Asia, or Africa, yet achieved comparable levels of complexity and sophistication. They solved problems of food production, social organization, and cultural expression in ways adapted to their unique environments. The Norte Chico culture showed that civilization could develop based on maritime resources rather than intensive agriculture. The Moche created sophisticated political organization without an extensive empire. The Nazca left mysterious lines etched in the desert that continue to fascinate researchers. The Wari pioneered administrative systems and road networks later expanded by the Inca. The Chimú built the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, and the Inca created an empire that stretched across one of the most challenging terrains on Earth. Each of these cultures adapted to their environment, developing technologies and practices suited to local conditions. They domesticated plants and animals suited to the Andes. They built architecture that withstood earthquakes. They created irrigation systems in the desert and agricultural terraces on steep mountain slopes. They wove textiles from cotton and camelid wool. They worked gold, silver, and bronze into beautiful objects. They developed complex iconographic traditions that communicated religious and political messages. The archaeological study of ancient Peru continues to reveal new discoveries. Excavations uncover previously unknown sites. New dating techniques refine our chronologies. Improved methods for analyzing artifacts provide insights into ancient technologies. Scholars from multiple disciplines work together to reconstruct ancient lifeways, combining archaeology with biology, chemistry, climate science, and other fields. We've learned much about ancient Peru, but many questions remain unanswered. We don't fully understand the Norte Chico economy or social organization. The purpose of the Nazca lines continues to be debated. The relationship between Wari and Tiwanaku remains unclear. We can't read all the information encoded in Quipus. Many aspects of Inca religion and worldview are poorly understood, and countless sites remain unexcavated, their secrets still hidden beneath the soil. These people lived thousands of years ago, but they were human beings like us. They fell in love, raised children, celebrated victories, mourned losses. They looked at the stars and wondered about the cosmos. They told stories to explain the world. They created beauty in art and music. They built monuments that still stand today. The history of ancient Peru is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. In environments that might seem inhospitable, people not only survived but thrived, creating complex societies and impressive cultural achievements. Their legacy continues in the languages, traditions, and monuments that survive to this day, reminding us of the remarkable diversity of human cultural expression. Thank you for listening to Sleepless History. May you have peaceful dreams of ancient Peru and the remarkable peoples who made it home.